The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Book 5, The High King. Chapter 17, The Snowstorm. The fair folk warriors, all save Doli, had turned back at the line of treeless crags marking the westernmost edge of the hills of Bran Galed. For beyond that point the land lay under the sway of Achren Deathlord. For some days now, the companions had toiled painfully through a wilderness of stone, where not even moss or lichen flourished. The sky was gray, and the few thin clouds no more than shreds of darker gray. It was as though an evil mist had seeped from the stronghold of Anuvan, stifling all living things and leaving only this rocky waste. The companions spoke little, husbanding their strength. For the first day within the borders of the land of death, they had been obliged to dismount and go on foot, leading the weary horses through the treacherous passes. Even the stallion Melinla showed signs of fatigue. The steed's powerful neck drooped, and his gait sometimes faltered. Lion, however, padded skillfully among the narrowest and most dangerous of ledges. Often, while the companions labored down one sharp descent to clamber up an even sharper slope, the enormous cat leaped from one crag to the next, and they would come upon her sitting with her tail coiled about her haunches, waiting for Fluider to scratch her ears, after which she would bound off once more. Doli, firmly gripping his staff, his white hood pulled well down over his face, trudged at the head of the little band. Taran had never ceased to wonder at the tireless dwarf who found, as though by secret sense, hidden footpaths and narrow ways that helped speed the harsh journey. Yet after a time, Doli's pace seemed to flag. Taran saw with growing concern and uneasiness that from time to time the dwarf would lose his footing and his step turn suddenly unsure. When Doli staggered and dropped to one knee, Taran ran to his side, alarmed, and tried to lift up the dwarf. The companions hurried to join him. Doli's usually ruddy face had grown molted, and he breathed only in painful gasps. He struggled to regain his feet.
"Curse this evil realm," he muttered. "Can't stand it as well as I thought. Don't gawk, give me a hand up."
Stubbornly, the dwarf refused to mount one of the horses, insisting he felt better when his feet were on the ground. When Taran urged him to rest, Doli angrily shook his head.
"I said I'd find a passage for you," he snapped. "And I mean to. Can't stand a bot's job. When the fair folk set about a task, they do it right, and don't dawdle over it."
Nevertheless, after a short while, Doli reluctantly consented to climb astride Melinla's. He fumbled with the stirrups, but grumbled irritably when Fluider helped him into the saddle. Even this relief was not long-lasting. The dwarf's head soon drooped weakly forward. He swayed unsteadily, and before Taran could reach him, lurched from the stallion's back and pitched to the ground. Taran quickly signaled a halt. "We'll go no further today," he told the dwarf. "By morning you'll have your strength again." Doli shook his head. His face was white, his crimson eyes had turned dull.
"No use waiting," he gasped. "I've been too long here. It'll grow worse. Must keep on. I can still guide you."
"Not at the cost of your life," Taran said. "Heaviad the smith will ride with you to the border. Lassar, son of Drudus, will help the rest of us find our way."
"Won't do," muttered the dwarf. "Take too long without fair folk's skill. Tie me to the saddle," he commanded.
He strove to raise himself from the ground, but fell back and lay motionless. His breathing grew rasping and violent. Taran cried out in alarm. "He's dying! Hurry, Fluider! Help me put him on Lion. She's the swiftest mount. Ride back with him. There may still be time."
"Leave me here," Doli gasped. "You can't spare Fluider. His sword is worth 10. No, 6 at least. Go quickly."
"That I will not do," replied Taran.
"Fool!"
choked the dwarf.
"Heed me," he commanded. "It must be done. Are you a war leader or an assistant pig keeper?"
Taran knelt by the dwarf, whose eyes were half closed, and gently put a hand on Doli's shoulder. "Need you ask, old friend? I'm an assistant pig keeper." Taran rose to meet the bard, who had hastened up with Lion, but when he turned back to the dwarf, the ground was empty. Doli had vanished.
"Where is he gone?"
shouted Fluider. An irritable voice came from somewhere near a boulder.
Here! Where else do you think?
Doli! Cried Taran. You were close to your death, and now...
I've turned invisible as any clodpole with half an ounce of sense can plainly see,
snorted Doli.
Should have thought of it before. Last time in Anulan, I was invisible most of the way. Never realized how it protected me.
Can it serve you now? Asked Taran, still a little bewildered. Dare you keep on?
Of course, the dwarf retorted. I'm better already, but I'll have to stay invisible as long as I can stand it, that is. Invisible! Hornets and wasps in my ears!
Good old Doli, Taran cried, seeking vainly to pump the dwarf's unseen hand.
Not that again, snapped the dwarf. I'd not do this willingly. Oh, my ears! For any mortal in Prydain! Oh, my head! Except you! And don't shout! My ears won't stand it.
Doli's staff, which had dropped to the ground, seemed to rise of itself as the invisible dwarf picked it up. From the motion of the staff, Taran could see that Doli had once again begun trudging ahead. Guiding themselves by the length of wood, the companions followed. Yet even without sight of the staff, they could have followed their way, led by the sound of loud and furious grumbling. Fluider was first to sight the gwythaints. In the distance, above a shallow ravine, 3 black-winged shapes soared and circled.
What have they found?
The bard cried.
Whatever it is, I hope we're not the ones to be found next.
Taran sounded his horn and signaled the warband to find whatever protection they could among the huge boulders. Eilonwy, disregarding Taran's orders, scrambled to the top of a high jutting stone and shaded her eyes.
I can't tell for sure,
Eilonwy said,
but it looks to me as though they've cornered something. Poor creature, it will not last long against them.
Gurgi crouched fearfully against a rock and tried to make himself as flat as a fish.
Nor will Gurgi if they see him,
he wailed.
They will seize his poor tender head with gashings and slashings. Pass on,
Glue shouted, his little face puckered in fright.
They're busy with their prey. Don't stop here like fools. Get as far away as we can. Oh, if I were a giant again, you'd not find me lingering.
The gwythaints narrowed their circle and had begun to swoop downward, seeking their kill. But suddenly what appeared to be a black cloud, with a dark shape leading it, streaked down from the eastern quarter of the sky. Before the surprised companions could follow its swift movement overhead, the cloud shattered as if by its leader's command into winged fragments that dove straight upon the huge birds. Even at this distance, Taran could hear the furious screams of the gwythaints as they veered aloft to face these strange assailants. Fluider had leaped up beside Eilonwy, and as Taran and Doli clambered to a vantage point, the bard shouted excitedly,
Crows? Great Bellin! I've never seen so many! Look at all the crows!
Like great black hornets, the crows swarmed over their enemy. It was not a single combat of bird against bird, but a battle in which whole troops of crows grappled and clung to the gwythaints, lashing wings, heedless of sharp beaks and talons, forcing the creatures earthward. When, by sheer strength, the gwythaints shook off their attackers, a new troop would form and renew the charge. The gwythaints sought to break free of their burden by plunging downward, scraping as closely as they dared against the sharp stones. But as they did, the crows pecked furiously at them, and the gwythaints spun and fluttered dizzily, losing their course and falling once again victim to the relentless onslaught. In a last burst of power, the gwythaints beat their way aloft. They turned and sped desperately northward, with the crows in hot pursuit. They vanished over the horizon, all save a solitary crow that flew swiftly toward the companions.
Caw!
Taran shouted and held out his arms. Jabbering at the top of his voice, the crow swooped down. His eyes glittered in triumph, and he flapped his shiny wings more proudly than a rooster. He gabbled, croaked, squawked, and poured forth such a torrent of yammering that Gurgi clapped his hands over his ears. From his perch on Taran's wrist, Ka bobbed his head and clacked his beak, thoroughly delighted with himself and never for a moment ceasing his chatter. Taran, trying vainly to interrupt the crow's raucous and boastful clamor, had despaired of learning any tidings from the roguish bird when Ka flapped his wings and sought to fly off again.
Achren!
Ka croaked.
Achren! Queen!
You've seen her? Taran caught his breath. He had given little thought to the once powerful queen since her flight from Caer Dallben. Where is she? The crow fluttered a little distance away, then returned, his beating wings urging Taran to follow him.
Close! Close! Gwythaints!
Eilonwy gasped. That's what we saw! The gwythaints have slain her!
Alive!
Ka answered.
Hurt!
Taran ordered the comet horsemen to await him, then leaped to the ground to follow after Ka. Eilonwy, Doli, and Gurgi hastened to join him. Glue refused to budge, remarking that he had already skinned himself on enough rocks and had no intention of going out of his way for anyone. Fluider hesitated a moment.
Yes, well, I suppose I shall go along too, should you need help in carrying her. But it doesn't sit well with me. Achren was eager enough to go her own way, and I'd rather think we shouldn't meddle. Not that I fear her, not for a moment. The truth of it is,
He hurriedly added as the harp strings tensed,
the woman makes me shudder. Since the day she threw me into her dungeon, I've noticed something unfriendly about her. She has no fondness for music, I can tell you. Nevertheless,
he cried.
A flam to the rescue!
Like a tattered bundle of black rags, the still form of Queen Achren lay in the fissure of a massive rock, where she had, in her last hope, pressed to escape the gwythaints' vicious beaks and talons. Yet her refuge, Taran saw pityingly, had offered the queen scant protection. Achren moaned faintly as the companions carefully lifted her from the crevice. Lion, who had followed along with the bard, crouched silently nearby and lashed her tail uneasily. Arkhan's face, drawn and deathly pale, had been badly slashed, and her arms bore many deep and bleeding wounds. Eilonwy held the woman and tried to revive her. Lion shall carry her back with us, Taran said. She will need more healing herbs than I have brought. More than her wounds, a fever has weakened her. She's gone long without food or drink. Her shoes are in ribbons, Eilonwy said. How far must she have wandered in this awful place? Poor Achren! I can't say I'm fond of her, but it makes my toes curl up just imagining what must have happened. Fluider, after helping move the unconscious queen to more level ground, had stayed a few paces away. Gurgi, too, chose to keep some distance between Achren and himself. Nevertheless, at Taran's bidding, they drew closer, and the bard, with many soothing words, held Lion steady while the other companions lifted Achren to the great cat's back.
Hurry along,
called the voice of Doli.
It's starting to snow.
White flakes had begun drifting from the heavy sky. Within little time, a biting wind swirled around the companions, and snow drove against them in an ever-thickening cloud. Needles of ice stung their faces. It grew more and more difficult to see, and as the storm gained in fury, even Doli could no longer be sure of the path. The companions staggered blindly in a file, each clutching the other, with Taran gripping an end of Doli's staff. Ka, almost entirely covered with snow, hunched up his wings and tried desperately to keep his perch on Taran's shoulder. Lion, burdened with the motionless queen, bent her great head against the gale and plodded onward, but the sure-footed cat often stumbled over hidden boulders and snow-filled pits. Once Gurgi yelled in terror and vanished as suddenly as if the earth had swallowed him. He had tumbled into a deep crevice, and by the time the companions were able to haul him out, the hapless creature had nearly turned into a shaggy icicle. He trembled so violently he could scarcely walk, and between them Taran and Fluider bore him along. The wind did not slacken. The snow fell in an impenetrable curtain, and the cold, already bitter, grew even more intense. Breathing was painful, and with each labored gasp, Taran felt the frigid draft like daggers in his lungs. Eilonwy half sobbed with cold and exhaustion, and she clung to Taran, striving to keep her footing as Doli led them through drifts that now had risen more than knee-high.
We can't go on,
the dwarf shouted above the wind.
Find shelter! Make our way to the horsemen when the snow lets up.
But the warriors, how shall they fare? Taran replied anxiously.
Better than we,
the dwarf cried.
Where they are, there's a good-sized cave I noticed along the cliff wall. Your young shepherd is bound to find it, never fear. Our trouble is finding something for ourselves.
However, even after long and painful searching, the dwarf discovered nothing more than a shallow gully below an overhanging ledge. The companions stumbled gratefully into it. Here they were protected against the worst battering of the wind and snow, but the cold still gripped them, and no sooner had they halted than their bodies seemed to stiffen, and they moved arms and legs only with the greatest difficulty. They clung together for warmth and pressed against Lion's thick coat of fur. Even this gave them little comfort, for, as night fell, the chill deepened. Taran stripped off his cloak and covered Eilonwy and Achren. Gurgi insisted on adding his sheepskin jacket, and he crouched with his shaggy arms wrapped around himself, his teeth chattering loudly. "I fear that Achren will not live the night," Taran murmured to Fluider. "She was too close to death when we found her. She will not have strength to stand such cold."
"Will any of us?" answered the bard. "Without a fire, we might just as well say farewell to each other right now."
"I don't know what you're complaining about," Eilonwy sighed. "I've never been so comfortable in all my life."
Taran looked at her in alarm. The girl did not stir under the cloak. Her eyes were half shut. Her voice faltered with drowsiness.
"Quite warm," she rambled on happily. "What a lovely goose-feather quilt I have! How odd! I dreamed we were all caught in a terrible storm. It wasn't pleasant at all. Or am I still dreaming? No matter. When I wake up, it will all be gone away."
Taran, his face drawn with anxiety, shook her roughly.
"Don't sleep," he cried. "If you sleep, it will be your death."
Eilonwy did not answer him, but only turned her head away and closed her eyes. Gurgi had curled up beside her and could not be roused. Taran himself felt a fatal drowsiness spreading over him. "Fire," he said. "We must build a fire."
"From what?"
Doli briskly replied.
"There's not a twig to be found in this wilderness. What will you burn? Our boots? Our cloaks? We'll freeze all the faster."
He flickered back into sight.
"And if I'm gonna freeze, I won't do it with hornets buzzing in my ears."
Fluider, who had been silent this while, reached behind him and unslung his harp. At this, Doli gave a furious shout.
"Harp music!"
he cried.
"My friend, your wits are frozen solid as ice."
"It shall give us the tune we need,"
replied Fluider. Taran dragged himself to the side of the bard. "Fluider, what do you mean to do?" The bard did not answer. For a long moment he held the harp lovingly in his hands and gently touched the strings. Then, with a quick motion, raised the beautiful instrument and smashed it across his knee. Taran cried out in anguish as the wood shattered into splinters, and the harp strings tore loose with the discordant burst of sound. Fluider let the broken fragments drop from his hands.
"Burn it,"
he said.
"It is woodwell season."
Taran seized the bard by the shoulders.
"What have you done?" he sobbed. "Gallant, foolish Flam! You have destroyed your harp for the sake of a moment's warmth. We need a greater fire than this wood can ever give us."
Doli, however, had quickly taken flint from his pouch and had struck a spark into the pitiful heap of splinters. Instantly, the wood blazed up, and sudden warmth poured over the companions. Taran stared amazed at the rising flames. The bits of wood seemed hardly to be consumed, yet the fire burned all the more brightly. Gurgi stirred and raised his head. His teeth had ceased their chattering, and color had returned to his frost-pinched face. Eilonwy too sat up and looked about her as though waking from a dream. At a glance, she understood what fuel the bard had offered, and tears sprang to her eyes.
"Don't give it a second thought,"
cried Fluider.
"The truth of the matter is that I'm delighted to be rid of it. I could never really play the thing, and it was more a burden than anything else. Great Bellin! I feel light as a feather without it. Believe me, I was never meant to be a bard in the first place, so it's all for the best."
In the depths of the flame, several harp strings split in two, and a puff of sparks flew into the air.
"But it gives a foul smoke,"
Fluider muttered, though the fire was burning clear and brilliant.
It makes my eyes water horribly.
The flames had now spread to all the fragments, and as the harp strings blazed, a melody sprang suddenly from the heart of the fire. Louder and more beautiful it grew, and the strains of music filled the air, echoing endlessly among the crags. Dying, the harp seemed to be pouring forth all the songs ever played upon it, and the sounds shimmered like the fire. All night the harp sang, and its melodies were of joy, sorrow, love, and valor. The fire never abated, and little by little, new life and strength returned to the companions. And as the notes soared upward, a wind rose from the south, parting the fallen snow like a curtain and flooding the hills with warmth. Only at dawn did the flames sink into the glowing embers and the voice of the harp fall silent. The storm had ended, the crags glistening with melting snow. Wordless and wondering, the companions left their shelter. Fluider lingered behind for a moment. Out of the harp, nothing remained but a single string, the one unbreakable string which Gwythain had given the bard long ago. Fluider knelt and drew it from the ashes. In the heat of the fire, the harp string had twisted and coiled around itself, but it glittered like pure gold,